Sometimes the most dangerous places on Earth aren't found on any map. They exist in the spaces between hope and despair, where human courage meets its ultimate test. In the remote mountains of Afghanistan, where the air is thin and death lurks behind every rock, a 23-year-old medic named Sarah Chen was about to discover that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about proving that you belong when everyone around you believes you don't. The dead zone got its name for a reason. No communication, no backup, and no room for mistakes. When Sarah volunteered for the most dangerous assignment of her military career, her commanding officers didn't just doubt her ability, they were already planning her replacement. But what they didn't know was that Sarah carried something more powerful than any weapon, a fierce determination forged in the fires of a childhood that had already tested her in ways they couldn't imagine. This is the story of 72 hours that would either break a rookie soldier or transform her into a legend. It's about the moment when everything you think you know about yourself gets stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of who you really are. And sometimes, that truth is more powerful than anyone ever expected. Sarah Chen had always been underestimated, and she had learned to use it as her secret weapon. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a quiet voice that often got lost in crowded rooms, she didn't look like someone who belonged in a war zone. But looks, as Sarah had discovered throughout her 23 years of life, could be devastatingly deceiving. The helicopter's rotors chopped through the thin mountain air as Sarah checked her medical supplies for the third time in 10 minutes. Across from her sat Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a battle-hardened medic with 8 years of combat experience and scars that told stories Sarah could only imagine. His eyes held the kind of skepticism she had grown accustomed to, the look that said she was about to get someone killed. "You sure you're ready for this, Chen?" Rodriguez shouted over the engine noise, his voice carrying doubt that cut deeper than any blade. "The dead zone isn't like the training simulations. Out there, people die when you make mistakes." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, ever since she had enlisted in the Army Medical Corps against everyone's advice. Her parents, both successful accountants from suburban California, had begged her to reconsider. Her college friends had called her crazy. Even her recruitment officer had tried to steer her toward a desk job in logistics, but Sarah had a reason for being here that none of them understood. When she was 12 years old, her younger brother Danny had collapsed during a family camping trip in the Sierra Nevada mountains. A severe asthma attack had turned a perfect summer day into a nightmare. The nearest hospital was 3 hours away, and the paramedics couldn't reach their remote campsite. Sarah had watched helplessly as Danny struggled to breathe, his lips turning blue while their parents panicked. It was a passing hiker, a former Navy medic named Tom Sullivan, who saved Danny's life. Using nothing but basic supplies from a first aid kit, Tom had kept Danny alive until help arrived. As Sarah watched the stranger work with calm precision under impossible pressure, something ignited inside her. She knew, with the absolute certainty that only comes to children, that she wanted to be that person for someone else someday. Now, 11 years later, she was flying into one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan to retrieve wounded soldiers from a forward operating base that had been cut off for 3 days. The base, nicknamed Dead Man's Rest by the troops stationed there, sat in a valley surrounded by enemy positions. Communication had been spotty, but the last transmission indicated multiple casualties and dwindling medical supplies. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset. 5 minutes to drop zone. Weather's getting worse, so we'll have a narrow window. Once you're on the ground, you're on your own until extraction. Sarah glanced out the window at the barren landscape below. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks shrouded in grey clouds that promised snow. It was beautiful in the way that only truly dangerous places could be. Remote, unforgiving, and completely indifferent to human survival. Rodriguez was still watching her, waiting for her to crack. She had dealt with his type before, men who saw her as a liability, a weak link in the chain that could get them all killed. During training, she had overheard him telling another medic that she was probably good enough for treating scraped knees at some safe base camp, but definitely not cut out for real combat medicine. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Sarah had already been tested in ways that had nothing to do with military training. After Danny's incident, she had thrown herself into emergency medicine with an intensity that worried her parents. She volunteered with search and rescue teams, trained as a wilderness first responder, and spent her summers working as a camp medic in remote locations. By the time she was 18, she had treated everything from severe burns to compound fractures, always in situations where professional help was hours away. The helicopter began its descent. and Sarah felt the familiar calm that always settled over her when things got serious. It was the same feeling she'd had when she was 16 and found herself alone with a hiker who had fallen 40 feet down a cliff face. While everyone else stood around discussing whether to wait for rescue or risk moving the injured man, Sarah had rappelled down with nothing but a basic first aid kit and her training. She had stabilized the hiker's spine and managed his pain for 6 hours until professional rescue arrived. "LZ in sight," the pilot announced. "Looks like we've got incoming weather. This is going to be tight." The landing zone was little more than a cleared patch of rocky ground surrounded by sandbags and concrete barriers. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah could see soldiers running toward them, hunched against the rotor wash. The base looked exactly like what it was, a small outpost hanging on by its fingernails in the middle of nowhere. Rodriguez was first off the helicopter, his movements efficient and professional despite his doubts about Sarah. She followed close behind, grabbing her medical pack and additional supplies that had been strapped to the helicopter's floor. The wind hit her like a physical blow, carrying the smell of diesel fuel, dust, and something else she didn't want to identify. A young lieutenant with dirt-streaked face approached them at a run. "Thank God you're here," he shouted. "We've got 6 wounded, 3 critical. Lost our medic 2 days ago to sniper fire." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had known this mission was dangerous, but hearing it spelled out so bluntly made it real in a way that all the briefings hadn't. They weren't just here to treat minor injuries, they were the only thing standing between these soldiers and death. The lieutenant led them toward a fortified building that served as the base's medical facility. As they ran across the open ground, Sarah heard the distant crack of rifle fire from the ridgeline above them. Rodriguez glanced at her sharply, but she kept her face forward and her pace steady. Inside the medical facility, the reality of their situation hit her immediately. The wounded soldiers were laid out on stretchers and makeshift beds, their injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to severe burns from an IED explosion. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the antiseptic odor of bandages that had been changed too many times. Rodriguez immediately went to the most critically wounded soldier, a young man with a sucking chest wound who was struggling to breathe. Sarah moved toward another patient, a soldier with severe burns on his arms and torso, but stopped when she heard Rodriguez curse under his breath. "This guy needs emergency surgery," Rodriguez said, looking up from the chest wound patient. "We need to get him evacuated now." The lieutenant shook his head. "No can do. Weather's closing in fast and we've been taking fire all morning. No helicopters getting in or out of here for at least 12 hours. Sarah watched Rodriguez's face as the implications sank in. Without proper surgical facilities, the soldier with the chest wound wouldn't last 12 hours. Rodriguez had the experience, but he didn't have the training for emergency field surgery. Sarah did. During her final year of medical training, she had spent 6 months working with a trauma surgeon who specialized in battlefield medicine. Dr. T. Maria Santos had taken Sarah under her wing after watching her handle a particularly difficult case with unusual composure. Santos had taught Sarah procedures that most medics would never attempt in field conditions, always with the caveat that these skills were for absolute emergencies only. Sarah moved closer to examine the chest wound patient. The soldier was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Blood was seeping around the edges of the field dressing, and his skin had the grey pallor that meant he was going into shock. "What's his name?" Sarah asked quietly. "Jackson," the lieutenant replied. "Private First Class, Marcus Jackson. Good kid. Just turned 19 last month." Sarah nodded and continued her examination. The wound was exactly what she had feared, a penetrating injury to the chest that had likely punctured his lung. Air was escaping into his chest cavity, putting pressure on his heart and making it impossible for him to breathe properly. Without immediate intervention, he would die within hours. Rodriguez watched her work, his expression unreadable. "You thinking what I think you're thinking, Chen?" Sarah met his eyes steadily. "He needs a chest tube, emergency thoracostomy. I can do it." The silence that followed was broken only by Jackson's labored breathing and the distant sound of gunfire. Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, weighing her words against everything he thought he knew about her capabilities. "You ever done one before?" he asked finally. 3 times during training. Once on a real patient. She didn't mention that the real patient had been during her wilderness rescue work, or that she had been alone on a mountainside with no backup when she did it. Rodriguez looked around the makeshift medical facility, taking in the other wounded soldiers who needed attention. Even if they could somehow evacuate Jackson, the others would suffer while they waited. He was facing the kind of impossible decision that defined combat medicine. Save one life and risk losing others, or spread their limited resources thin and possibly lose everyone. The other patients need attention too, Sarah said, reading his thoughts. I can handle Jackson while you work on the others, but we need to move fast. Another soldier entered the facility at that moment, his face grim. Lieutenant, we just lost radio contact with command, and the lookout reports movement on the eastern ridge. Could be nothing, could be trouble. Sarah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. They were cut off, possibly surrounded, with limited supplies and multiple critical patients. This was exactly the kind of scenario that had ended the careers of more experienced medics than her. But as she looked down at Jackson's pale face, she thought about Tom Sullivan and the calm precision he had shown when Danny was dying. Sometimes Sarah realized you didn't get to choose when your moment of truth arrived. I need to set up for the procedure, she said to Rodriguez. Can you handle the others for 10 minutes? Rodriguez studied her face for another long moment, then nodded slowly. Do it. But Chen, if you're not sure about something, anything at all, you tell me immediately. This kid's life isn't worth proving a point. Sarah began pulling supplies from her medical pack, her hands moving with automatic precision despite the adrenaline coursing through her system.
As she prepared to attempt a procedure that could save Jackson's life or kill him faster than his wounds would, she heard her drill instructor's voice in her head. In the field, there are no second chances.
You either do the job right the first time, or people die. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows of the medical facility. Sarah could hear soldiers shouting orders and the sound of equipment being secured. The storm that would trap them here for the next 12 hours was moving in fast. She looked down at Jackson, who was watching her with eyes that held too much fear for someone so young. You're going to be okay, she told him quietly. I know what I'm doing. As Sarah began the procedure that would either save Jackson's life or prove that Rodriguez and everyone else had been right about her all along, she had no way of knowing that this moment was just the beginning. The dead zone was about to test everything she thought she knew about herself, and before it was over, she would discover that survival wasn't just about medical skill or training. It was about finding the strength to keep going when everything around you was falling apart, and everyone was counting on you to be stronger than you had ever imagined you could be. The storm was coming, the enemy was closing in, and Sarah Chen was about to learn what it really meant to be tested by fire. The chest tube procedure took Sarah exactly 8 minutes and 42 seconds. She knew because Rodriguez counted every one of them aloud, his voice tight with tension as he worked on the burn victim across the room. When the last suture was in place and Jackson's breathing suddenly eased into a more natural rhythm, the silence in the medical facility was profound. Good work, Chen, Rodriguez said quietly, but Sarah barely heard him. She was focused on Jackson's vital signs, watching the monitor that showed his oxygen levels slowly climbing back toward normal. The immediate crisis was over, but she knew the real test was just beginning. The storm hit 2 hours later with a violence that shook the entire outpost. Wind howled around the buildings like something alive and angry, and snow began falling so heavily that visibility dropped to mere feet. Sarah had never experienced weather like this, the kind of storm that could kill you just by stepping outside unprepared. She was checking on her patients when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the medical facility look like a scene from a nightmare. In the distance, Sarah could hear the rumble of the generator and shouted commands from the soldiers outside securing equipment against the storm. Power's probably going to be intermittent, Rodriguez said, playing his flashlight over the monitoring equipment. We need to prioritize who gets the electronic support and who we monitor manually. Sarah nodded, already mentally cataloging which patients were most critical. Jackson needed continuous monitoring of his chest tube drainage, but the burn victim required powered pain management equipment. The other wounded soldiers were stable for now, but that could change quickly in these conditions. It was then that Lieutenant Morrison appeared in the doorway, his face grim in the emergency lighting. We've got a problem, he said without preamble. Perimeter guards report movement on multiple sides. Could be the weather playing tricks, but we have to assume hostile contact is imminent. Dead malignity. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had prepared for medical emergencies, but the possibility of actual combat while treating patients was something entirely different. During training, the scenarios had always been clean. Either you were treating wounded or you were fighting, never both simultaneously. Rodriguez moved to the window and peered out through the reinforced glass. How many are we talking about? Unknown, Morrison replied. Could be a few scouts, could be a full assault. With this weather, we can't get air support or reinforcements. We're on our own until it clears. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. The outpost held maybe 30 soldiers total, and 6 of them were lying wounded in this room. If they came under serious attack, every able-bodied person would be needed for defense. But someone had to stay with the wounded. "I'll stay with the patients," she said immediately.
Rodriguez turned to stare at her.
"Chen, if this place gets overrun, being in here is a death sentence. These guys know what they signed up for." "So did I," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm not leaving them." Morrison looked between them, clearly torn. Sarah could see him calculating odds and resources, weighing the value of one medic against the firepower she might provide in a fight. She had qualified expert with both pistol and rifle during training, but she was still just one person. A sharp crack echoed from somewhere outside, followed by shouting. Morrison's radio crackled to life with urgent voices reporting muzzle flashes on the eastern perimeter. The attack, whatever it was, had begun. "I need every gun I can get," Morrison said finally. "Rodriguez, you with me? Chen, you hold down the medical station. If things go sideways, you have standing orders to prioritize the most salvageable patients." Sarah knew what that meant. If the outpost was about to be overrun, she would have to make choices about who to try to save and who to leave behind. It was the kind of decision that haunted medics for the rest of their lives, assuming they survived to have a rest of their lives. Rodriguez hesitated at the doorway. "You sure about this, Chen? Last chance to change your mind. AFS capes are passable. Darking 2 beds." Kuchi said that he was a no-wall. She changed, patience fully. Nutting on the medical facility of her travel, and he raised his fingers in mystery from a passable date of birth. The burn victim, Corporal Williams, was awake and watching her with eyes that held too much pain and too much trust. The other 4 soldiers were stable but still dependent on her care for their survival. "I'm sure," she said. After Rodriguez and Morrison left, the medical facility felt like a tomb. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows that seemed to move with every flicker, and the sound of the storm outside was punctuated by intermittent gunfire from the perimeter. Sarah moved between her patients, checking vitals and adjusting medications, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. It was Corporal Williams who spoke first. "Doc, you ever been in a firefight before?" Sarah considered lying, then decided he deserved the truth. "No, this is my first deployment." Williams managed a pained smile. "Well, you picked a hell of a time to start. You scared?" Sarah checked his IV line before answering. "Terrified," she admitted. "But fear isn't always a bad thing. It keeps you sharp." "My daddy always said that courage isn't about not being afraid," said another voice from across the room. Private Carson, who had taken shrapnel in his leg and shoulder, was propped up on his stretcher watching her. "It's about doing what needs doing even when you're scared out of your mind." The gunfire outside was getting more intense, and Sarah could hear the deep thump of grenades exploding somewhere beyond the perimeter. She tried not to think about Rodriguez and Morrison out there in the storm, fighting an enemy they couldn't see clearly against odds they couldn't calculate. That was when the power failed completely. The emergency lighting died with a final flicker, plunging the medical facility into absolute darkness. Sarah's hands moved automatically to the tactical flashlight on her belt, but before she could activate it, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze, the unmistakable whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The first explosion hit the communications building 50 yards away, lighting up the night with orange fire that cast twisted shadows through the windows. The second hit closer, rattling the medical facility and sending dust raining down from the ceiling. Sarah threw herself over Jackson's stretcher, shielding him with her body as debris crashed against the reinforced walls. "Everybody stay low," she shouted, though she could barely hear her own voice over the ringing in her ears. "I need to check for damage." Using her flashlight, she quickly moved between patients, looking for new injuries from flying debris. Williams had a small cut on his forehead from falling plaster, but everyone else seemed unhurt. That was when she noticed the problem with the monitoring equipment. The power surge from the nearby explosion had fried most of the electronic systems. Jackson's chest tube monitor was dead, which meant she would have to check his drainage manually. Williams' pain management pump had also failed, and without it, his burns would cause agony that could send him into shock. Sarah grabbed her manual monitoring kit and began working by flashlight, checking Jackson's breathing and pulse while mentally calculating how much medication she could safely give Williams without electronic monitoring. Outside, the gunfire was becoming more sporadic, which could mean the attack was being repelled or that the defenders were running out of ammunition. It was then that she heard voices outside the medical facility, Voices speaking in a language that definitely wasn't English. Sarah froze, her flashlight beam wavering as she processed what this meant. Enemy forces had penetrated the perimeter and were now moving between the buildings. She was alone with 6 wounded soldiers and no way to communicate with the rest of the outpost. Moving as quietly as possible, she turned off her flashlight and felt her way to the window. Through the storm and darkness, she could make out shapes moving between buildings, at least 4 figures with weapons, moving with the careful coordination of trained fighters. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She had her service pistol, but she was massively outgunned and outnumbered. The medical facility had reinforced walls, but the door wasn't designed to withstand a determined assault. If the enemy soldiers discovered the wounded inside, the best outcome would be capture. The worst didn't bear thinking about. That was when Private Carson whispered from his stretcher, "Doc, there's something you should know about this building." Sarah crept back to him, keeping her voice barely audible. "What?" "There's a tunnel," Carson said, "built during the original construction. Connects to the command bunker on the other side of the compound. Most people don't know about it. It was supposed to be for emergency evacuation of wounded." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. "Where?" Carson pointed toward the far corner of the facility, where medical supplies were stacked against the wall. "Behind those boxes. There's a hidden panel in the floor. But Doc, the tunnel's narrow and it floods during heavy rain. With this storm," Sarah understood immediately. The tunnel might be their salvation, but it could also be a death trap. Moving 6 wounded soldiers through a narrow, possibly flooded underground passage in the dark would be incredibly dangerous. But staying here and waiting for enemy soldiers to find them might be worse. Another explosion lit up the night, closer this time. Sarah could hear boots running past the medical facility and harsh voices shouting orders. Whatever was happening out there, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. She made her decision. "Listen carefully," she whispered to her patients. "We're going to move to a safer location. I need everyone who can move to help those who can't. No lights, no talking, unless absolutely necessary. Jackson, you're on a stretcher no matter what. Williams, can you walk if I support you?" Williams gritted his teeth and nodded. "I'll do whatever you need, Doc." Sarah began moving the medical supplies as quietly as possible, searching for the hidden panel Carson had described. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline and cold, making the work clumsy and slow. Behind her, she could hear the other wounded soldiers shifting position, preparing to move despite their injuries. She found the panel just as voices became audible right outside the door. Enemy soldiers were conducting a building-by-building search, and the medical facility was next on their list. Sarah's fingers fumbled with the concealed latch, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The panel opened with a soft click, revealing a rectangular opening that dropped down into darkness. Sarah played her flashlight into the tunnel and saw exactly what Carson had warned her about, standing water reflecting her light back up at her. "How deep?" she whispered. Carson had managed to drag himself over to look, maybe 18 inches at this end. Could be deeper further in. The tunnel's about 200 yards long. Sarah looked back at her patients and made rapid calculations. Jackson would have to be carried on his stretcher, which meant the tunnel had to be wide enough and the water couldn't be too deep. Williams could probably wade through if she supported him. The others would have to help each other. The voices outside were getting closer. Sarah could distinguish at least 3 different speakers, all male, all armed, based on the sound of equipment they were carrying. They were being methodical about their search, which meant they would definitely check the medical facility. "We go now," she whispered. "Jackson first on the stretcher, then Williams with my support. Carson, can you help Yamamoto? Stevens and Brown, you're on your own, but stay close." As Sarah prepared to lower Jackson's stretcher into the tunnel, she realized that everything she had experienced up to this point had been preparation for this moment. All the training, all the wilderness rescues, all the time she had been tested and doubted, it had all been leading to this. 6 soldiers were depending on her to get them out alive, and failure wasn't an option. She could hear the enemy soldiers trying the door handle. In 30 seconds, maybe less, they would force their way in and discover the medical facility was empty. If Sarah and her patients were lucky, the soldiers would assume they had been evacuated earlier. If they weren't lucky, the soldiers would search more thoroughly and discover the tunnel entrance. Sarah took one last look around the medical facility that had been her world for the past few hours. Equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars would be left behind, along with supplies that could save lives. But none of that mattered compared to the 6 wounded soldiers who were trusting her with their lives. As she began lowering Jackson into the dark water of the tunnel, Sarah thought about Tom Sullivan, and the calm precision he had shown when Danny was dying. Sometimes, she realized, being a medic wasn't about having all the right equipment or perfect conditions. Sometimes it was about making impossible choices in the dark and trusting your training to see you through. The water was shockingly cold, and Sarah realized that hypothermia might kill her patients just as effectively as enemy bullets. But there was no other choice. Behind her, she could hear the enemy soldiers forcing the door. In a few moments, they would discover that the medical facility appeared to be abandoned. Sarah hoped they wouldn't look too closely at the corner where the medical supplies had been hastily moved. Everything now depended on reaching the other end of the tunnel before they were discovered, before the wounded soldiers succumbed to shock or cold, and before Sarah herself gave in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. As she waded into the tunnel behind Jackson's stretcher, supporting Williams with one arm while trying to keep her medical supplies dry, Sarah realized that her real test was just beginning. The water in the tunnel was deeper than Carson had estimated. By the time Sarah had waded 50 yards, supporting Corporal Williams while guiding Jackson's stretcher, the freezing water was up to her waist. Behind her, she could hear the other wounded soldiers struggling through the darkness, their labored breathing echoing off the tunnel walls. "Doc," Williams whispered through chattering teeth. "I can't feel my legs anymore." Sarah's heart sank. Hypothermia was setting in faster than she had anticipated. Williams' burns made him particularly vulnerable to heat loss, and the combination of shock, medication, and icy water was proving nearly fatal. She had to make a decision that went against every instinct she had as a medic. She had to choose speed over care. "Hold on to the stretcher rail," she told Williams. "Let it support your weight. We need to move faster." Jackson was semi-conscious on the stretcher, which Sarah now realized was both a blessing and a curse. He wasn't aware of the cold, but he also couldn't help himself if something went wrong. His chest tube was still functioning, but in the darkness and chaos of the tunnel, monitoring it properly was impossible. Behind them, Private Carson was struggling to help Yamamoto, whose leg wounds were bleeding again from the exertion. Stevens and Brown, the two least injured soldiers, were doing their best to assist, but everyone was operating on reserves they didn't actually have. That was when Sarah heard the sound she had been dreading. Voices echoing from the tunnel entrance behind them. They found the tunnel. Carson whispered unnecessarily. Sarah calculated distances and timing in her head. They were maybe halfway to the other end, moving far too slowly, and now they were being pursued by an unknown number of enemy soldiers who weren't wounded, weren't hypothermic, and weren't trying to carry stretchers through flooded tunnels. "Everyone who can move faster needs to go ahead," she said quietly. "Get to the other end and bring help back." "We're not leaving you, Doc," Stevens said immediately. "That's not a suggestion, it's an order," Sarah replied, with more authority than she felt. "Stevens, Brown, Carson, if you can manage it, go. Williams and I will bring Jackson." The three soldiers hesitated, clearly torn between military discipline and the instinct not to abandon wounded comrades. Sarah made the choice for them. "Move," she hissed. "That's the only way any of us survive this." As the three soldiers began wading ahead as quickly as their injuries would allow, Sarah heard splashing from behind them that sounded distinctly different from their own movements. The pursuit was gaining ground. Williams was barely conscious now, his weight becoming a dead-weight burden that Sarah struggled to support. Jackson's stretcher kept bumping against the tunnel walls, and Sarah was terrified that the impacts would dislodge his chest tube. In the absolute darkness, with only her tactical flashlight providing minimal illumination, every step was a potential disaster. "Doc," Williams mumbled, "leave me. Take Jackson and go." "Not happening," Sarah said firmly, though privately she was starting to wonder if Williams was right. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. She couldn't move fast enough to save all of them, and staying together meant they might all die. That was when she heard gunfire behind them. The sounds were unmistakable, automatic weapons firing in the confined space of the tunnel. The enemy soldiers had either encountered something, or they were firing at shadows, or they were executing wounded soldiers they had found. None of the possibilities were good. Sarah made a decision that would haunt her forever, or save all their lives. She stopped moving forward, and turned to face the threat behind them. "Williams, get behind Jackson's stretcher. Stay low and don't move unless I tell you to." Sarah drew her service pistol and moved to a position where she could see back down the tunnel. The water around her legs was so cold it felt like liquid fire, and her hands were shaking so badly she wasn't sure she could aim accurately. But she had made a promise to these soldiers, and she intended to keep it. The voices were getting closer. Sarah could distinguish at least two different speakers, both male, both speaking in urgent tones that suggested they were pursuing someone. The gunfire had stopped, which might mean they had eliminated a threat or decided to be more cautious about their approach. Sarah waited in the darkness, her pistol trained on the bend in the tunnel where the pursuit would first become visible. She had qualified expert marksman during training, but shooting at static targets in good lighting was completely different from combat in a flooded tunnel, with lives depending on her accuracy. Time seemed to stretch like elastic. Sarah could hear Williams breathing behind her, harsh and rapid with pain and fear. Jackson was making soft sounds that might have been unconsciousness or might have been pain. Somewhere ahead of them, hopefully, Stevens, Brown, and Carson were reaching safety and summoning help. The first enemy soldier appeared around the bend in the tunnel. Sarah saw the muzzle flash of his weapon before she saw him clearly. A brief strobe that lit up his position and revealed that he was closer than she had expected. Her training took over without conscious thought. Sarah fired 3 shots in rapid succession, aiming for center mass the way she had been taught. The soldier went down hard, his weapon clattering against the tunnel wall. But Sarah knew there were at least 2 of them, and now she had revealed her position. "American soldiers ahead!" she shouted in English, hoping desperately that someone in authority would hear. "Wounded personnel, medical evacuation in progress." The response was immediate. Automatic weapons fire that turned the water around Sarah into a churning mass of splashes and ricochets. She threw herself over Jackson's stretcher, shielding him with her body while trying to keep her weapon ready. A bullet hit the tunnel wall inches from her head, spraying concrete fragments across her back. Another punched through the air where she had been standing moments before. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she was probably going to die in this tunnel, but she was not going to die quietly. She rose up and fired her remaining shots toward the muzzle flashes, not aiming carefully but trying to suppress the enemy fire long enough to give Stevens, Brown, and Carson time to reach help. The slide of her pistol locked back on an empty magazine, and Sarah realized she had no more ammunition. That was when she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. American voices shouting commands from the far end of the tunnel. "Friendly forces, approaching from the rear. Cease fire and identify yourselves." "Medic Sarah Chen," she shouted back. 6 wounded for evacuation, hostiles behind us.
What happened next occurred with the swift precision of a well-executed military operation.
Combat soldiers from the command bunker moved past Sarah and her patients toward the enemy position, while medics and support personnel began the process of evacuating the wounded through the other end of the tunnel. Sarah found herself being physically lifted and carried by soldiers who seemed impossibly large and competent after her ordeal in the tunnel. Williams and Jackson were loaded onto proper medical stretchers, and within minutes they were all in the warmth and safety of the command bunker's medical bay. It wasn't until she was sitting under emergency blankets drinking hot coffee while a medic treated her for hypothermia that Sarah realized what she had accomplished. Not only had she successfully performed emergency surgery in field conditions, she had also led a medical evacuation through enemy territory and defended her patients under fire. Most importantly, every single one of her patients had survived. Rodriguez found her 2 hours later, after the storm had begun to clear, and communication with the outside world had been restored. His left arm was in a sling from a shrapnel wound, but he was alive and walking. He sat down beside Sarah without saying anything for a long moment. "Heard about your tunnel adventure," he said finally. Sarah nodded, too exhausted for conversation. "Also heard you dropped an enemy soldier in the dark with a pistol while protecting wounded patients." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "How did you hear that?" Rodriguez smiled. The first time Sarah had seen him look genuinely pleased since they'd met. "Carson's been telling everyone who'll listen. Says you're the reason they're all alive." Sarah felt something warm spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. For 2 years, she had wondered if she was really cut out for combat medicine. Every training exercise, every simulation, every practical exam had been shadowed by the doubt that she might not be strong enough, fast enough, or brave enough when it really mattered. Now she knew. Dr. Maria Santos, the trauma surgeon who had trained Sarah in emergency procedures, had told her something during their last conversation before deployment. "The difference between good medics and great ones isn't technical skill," Dr. Santos had said. "It's what you do when everything goes wrong and you're the only thing standing between your patients and disaster." 3 days later, when the evacuation helicopters finally arrived to extract the wounded and the outpost personnel, Sarah was already back on duty. Jackson had been stabilized and was expected to make a full recovery. Williams was en route to a burn center in Germany where specialists would complete his treatment. The other 4 soldiers were all healing well and would return to duty within weeks. Colonel Martinez, the base commander who had flown in with the evacuation force, personally debriefed Sarah about the tunnel evacuation. When he finished taking her statement, he studied her for a long moment, Chen, I've been doing this for 22 years, he said. I've seen medics crack under pressure that was a fraction of what you faced. What you did in that tunnel, getting 6 wounded soldiers to safety while under pursuit, then defending them against enemy fire, that's the kind of thing that gets written about in textbooks. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. I was just doing my job, sir. No, Martinez said firmly. You were doing everyone's job. Medic, soldier, leader, all at once, under conditions that would break most people. Rodriguez tells me he had doubts about you when you first arrived. Sarah glanced over at Rodriguez, who was nearby preparing equipment for transport. He caught her eye and nodded slightly, acknowledgement of the truth and an apology wrapped into a single gesture. Rodriguez doesn't have doubts anymore, Martinez continued. Neither do I. The army needs more medics like you, Chen. People who can be trusted to do the impossible when everything goes wrong. As Sarah watched the wounded soldiers being loaded onto evacuation helicopters, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had started with a 12-year-old girl watching her brother nearly die on a mountainside, continued through years of training and doubt and preparation, and led to 72 hours that had tested everything she thought she knew about herself. She had walked into the dead zone as a rookie medic that everyone expected to fail. She was walking out as something else entirely. A combat veteran who had proven that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but about doing what needed to be done regardless of fear. The helicopter carrying Jackson and Williams lifted off first, disappearing into a sky that was finally clear after days of storms. Sarah watched until it was just a speck on the horizon, then turned back toward the outpost where Rodriguez was waiting with their gear. Ready to head home, Chen? He asked. Sarah looked back at the mountains that had tested her so thoroughly, then at the soldiers who had trusted her with their lives, and finally at Rodriguez, who no longer looked at her with doubt, but with something that might have been respect. Ready? She said. Day. As the helicopter lifted off from the landing zone, Sarah caught a glimpse of the tunnel entrance that had been her gateway to discovery. From the air, the outpost looked smaller and more vulnerable than it had felt when she was fighting for her patients' lives inside it. But Sarah knew that appearance was deceiving, just like people's initial assumptions about a quiet medic who didn't look like she belonged in a war zone. Sometimes the most dangerous tests come disguised as ordinary moments. Sometimes the biggest challenges are waiting in places no one expects them. And sometimes the people everyone expects to fail are exactly the ones who surprise everyone, including themselves, by walking out when others thought it was impossible. Sarah Chen had walked into the dead zone as a rookie. She walked out as a soldier who had earned her place through fire, water, darkness, and the kind of courage that only reveals itself when everything is on the line. The doubters had been wrong about her, but more importantly, she had learned to stop doubting herself. In the end, that might have been the most valuable lesson of all.